Sarah Chen sat quietly in seat 14C, her small fingers tracing the colorful cover of her favorite book, The Magic Treehouse. The 9-year-old girl had been looking forward to this flight from Boston to Atlanta for weeks. It would be her first time visiting her grandmother since last Christmas, and her mother had surprised her with first-class tickets using the points she had saved up from her job as a pediatrician. The morning had started perfectly. Dr. Lisa Chen, Sarah's mother, had woken her up early with the smell of chocolate chip pancakes, their special tradition before any big trip. Sarah wore her lucky purple sweater, the one with tiny silver stars that twinkled when she moved, matched with comfortable black leggings and her most practical traveling shoes. As they waited at Gate B7 at Logan International Airport, Sarah couldn't contain her excitement. She bounced on her heels, watching through the large windows as their plane taxied to the gate. "Mom, do you think Grandma made her famous dumplings for us?" she asked, her dark eyes sparkling with anticipation. "I'm sure she did, sweetheart," Dr. Chen replied, checking their boarding passes one last time. "You know she always makes extra, just for you." When they finally boarded the plane, Sarah couldn't believe how spacious the first-class seats were. Each one looked like a tiny throne, with plenty of legroom and a screen that seemed twice as large as the ones in economy class. The flight attendant, a kind-faced woman named Jenny, had given Sarah a special children's welcome kit containing colored pencils, an activity book, and a small stuffed airplane. "Would you like some apple juice before takeoff, Miss Sarah?" Jenny asked, treating the young girl with the same respect she showed adult passengers. Sarah nodded enthusiastically, carefully accepting the plastic cup with both hands just as her mother had taught her. The first 30 minutes of boarding went smoothly. Sarah watched as other passengers filed past them to the economy section, some smiling at her, others too busy with their phones or luggage to notice. She felt proud sitting in first class, knowing her mother had worked hard to make this trip special. Dr. Chen helped Sarah set up her area, making sure her backpack was properly stored under the seat in front of her and her seatbelt was securely fastened. They had their own little two-seat section, which felt like a private corner of the sky. "Remember what we talked about for the flight?" Dr. Chen asked softly. "Yes, Mom," Sarah replied, sitting up straighter. Inside voice, "Be polite to everyone, and ask for help if I need anything." Just then, a commotion began near the front of the plane. A woman's loud voice carried through the cabin, complaining about something to the flight attendants. Sarah couldn't quite make out the words, but the tone made her shrink slightly in her seat. Through the gap between seats, Sarah caught glimpses of the woman, tall, with expensive-looking clothes and perfectly styled blonde hair. She carried a designer handbag that probably cost more than all of Sarah's birthday presents combined. The woman's face was twisted in an expression that reminded Sarah of her classmate Emma when she didn't get her way. "That's my seat." The woman's voice grew louder as she approached their row. "I specifically requested 14A, and I don't understand why you people can't get anything right." Catherine Whitman stood in the aisle, her shadow falling across Sarah's book. She looked first at Dr. Chen, then at Sarah, her lips pressing into a thin line. The temperature in their corner of first class seemed to drop several degrees. "There must be some mistake," Whitman said, her voice dripping with disdain as she waved her boarding pass at Jenny, who had hurried over to help. "I always sit in first class, and I certainly don't expect to be seated next to." She left the sentence hanging, but her meaning was clear from the way her eyes swept dismissively over Sarah and her mother. Sarah felt her cheeks grow hot, and she wished she could disappear into her seat. She'd experienced this before at school, but her mother had always told her to hold her head high and not let anyone make her feel less than who she was. Dr. Chen straightened in her seat, her professional calm masking the protective anger building inside her. She had dealt with prejudiced patients before, but seeing someone direct that hatred toward her daughter made her blood boil. Still, she kept her voice steady, knowing Sarah was watching how she handled the situation. Little did any of them know, this was just the beginning of what would become a flight none of them would ever forget. Catherine Whitman's face grew redder as Jenny, the flight attendant, calmly checked her boarding pass. "Ms. Whitman, your assigned seat is actually 14B, which is right beside Ms. Chen and her daughter. They have the correct seats." "This is unacceptable," Whitman snapped, her voice rising even higher. "I demand to be moved. I'm a platinum member, and I refuse to sit next to." She gestured vaguely at Sarah and her mother, making several nearby passengers turn their heads. Sarah clutched her book tighter, trying to make herself as small as possible. She had never understood why some people acted this way. At school, her best friend Emma was white, and Emma's parents always treated her like their own daughter. But this woman reminded her of the mean ladies she sometimes saw in movies, the ones who thought they were better than everyone else. "I apologize, Ms. Whitman, but the flight is completely full," Jenny explained professionally, though her eyes had hardened. "These passengers have paid for their seats just like you have. If you prefer not to sit in your assigned seat, we can try to accommodate you on a later flight." Whitman's nostrils flared. She looked around the cabin, clearly hoping other passengers would support her, but was met with disapproving stares. A man in a business suit across the aisle had already taken out his phone and was quietly recording the incident. "Fine," she spat, roughly shoving her designer bag under the seat. As she sat down, she made a show of pulling out a travel-sized bottle of hand sanitizer and dramatically cleaning her hands, armrests, and everything within reach. Dr. Chen placed a protective hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Would you like to switch seats with me, sweetheart?" she whispered, but Sarah shook her head. She didn't want to show this mean lady that she was scared. The next 20 minutes were tense as the remaining passengers boarded. Whitman made several loud phone calls, complaining about the terrible service and how the airline had gone downhill by letting just anyone into first class. She specifically mentioned how children shouldn't be allowed in premium cabins and how some people didn't know their place. Sarah tried to focus on her book, but the words kept blurring as tears threatened to form in her eyes. She blinked them back, remembering what her mother always said about being strong. Still, her hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages. When the flight attendants began their safety demonstration, Whitman pulled out her laptop, deliberately taking up more than her share of space. Her elbow kept bumping into Sarah's arm, but each time Sarah politely moved away, trying to avoid conflict. "Mom," Sarah whispered, "can I have some water?" Before Dr. Chen could respond, Whitman interrupted. "Flight attendant," she called out loudly. "I need to speak to the purser immediately. The air quality in this section is absolutely unacceptable." Jenny approached once again, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Ms. Whitman, we're about to take off. You'll need to style your laptop and fasten your seatbelt." "Not until I speak to your supervisor," Whitman insisted. "I pay too much money to be subjected to these conditions. And this child keeps fidgeting and disturbing me." Several passengers were now openly watching the situation unfold. A woman behind them muttered, "Someone needs to teach that Karen a lesson." An elderly gentleman across the aisle shook his head disapprovingly at Whitman's behavior. Dr. Chen finally spoke up, her voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, my daughter has been nothing but polite. If you have concerns about the seating arrangement, please address them with the flight staff without making personal comments." Whitman turned to face Dr. Chen, her eyes blazing with anger and prejudice. "Listen here, you and your." She stopped mid-sentence as the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their immediate departure. Jenny returned with the lead flight attendant, who gave Whitman a final warning about her behavior. "Ms. Whitman, if you cannot maintain appropriate conduct, we will be forced to remove you from this flight. This is your only warning." As the plane began to taxi, Sarah reached for her water bottle, accidentally dropping her book in the process. What happened next would shock everyone on board and set in motion a chain of events that would change lives forever. The book slipped from Sarah's fingers, landing softly near Whitman's designer shoes. As Sarah politely began to reach for it, Whitman's reaction was explosive and completely unexpected. "Don't you dare touch me," Whitman shrieked, suddenly shoving Sarah's shoulder with enough force to make the child slam back into her seat. "How dare you try to get your dirty hands near my shoes?" The impact made Sarah's head hit the window, and tears immediately sprang to her eyes. The physical pain was sharp, but the shock and humiliation hurt even more. Several passengers gasped audibly at the assault. "Did you just put your hands on my daughter?" Dr. Chen's voice was deadly quiet as she unbuckled her seatbelt. The usual calm demeanor of the pediatrician had vanished, replaced by the fierce protective instinct of a mother. Whitman wasn't finished. Her face contorted with hatred as she launched into a racist tirade, using slurs and insults that made several nearby passengers cover their mouths in horror. You people think you can do whatever you want, she snarled. First class isn't for. She never finished her sentence because multiple things happened at once. The man across the aisle stood up, phone still recording. A woman in the row behind them pressed her call button repeatedly. Two other passengers started shouting for flight attendants. Sarah began to cry quietly, her small body shaking. She had never been hit by an adult before, and the shock of it, combined with the horrible words, overwhelmed her. Her shoulder throbbed where Whitman had shoved her. Jenny and two other flight attendants rushed to their row. "What's going on here?" Jenny demanded, though the concern in her eyes as she looked at Sarah suggested she had seen everything. "This woman just assaulted my 9-year-old daughter," Dr. Chen stated firmly, her arm now protectively around Sarah. "She pushed her hard enough to make her hit the window, and she used racial slurs against us. Multiple passengers witnessed it." "She's lying." Whitman screamed, but her protests were drowned out by other passengers speaking up. "I got it all on video," the man with the phone announced, including the physical assault on the child and the racist language. "So did I," added a college student a few rows back, holding up her phone. "I started recording when she first began harassing them during boarding." The lead flight attendant, a tall man named Marcus, arrived on the scene. After a quick consultation with his colleagues, he spoke into his radio. "Captain, we have a code red in first class. A passenger has physically assaulted a minor and is creating a serious disturbance." Whitman's face, which had been red with anger, suddenly turned pale. The reality of her actions seemed to finally hit her as she realized just how many people had witnessed and recorded her behavior. "I want to press charges," Dr. Chen declared, her voice shaking with controlled anger. "She assaulted my child. This is a federal crime." Marcus nodded grimly. "The captain has already contacted ground control. We're returning to the gate, and law enforcement will be waiting." Sarah continued crying softly, but the kindness of strangers was already helping to comfort her. A grandmother typed from across the aisle offered her a chocolate bar. The college student who had been recording came forward to show Sarah pictures of her own puppy on her phone, trying to distract her. Whitman, now seeing the serious trouble she was in, tried to backtrack. "I didn't mean to. It was an accident. She startled me." But her previous racist rant had been too clearly recorded, her actions too obviously deliberate. As the plane began its taxi back to the gate, the other passengers in first class created a protective circle around Sarah and her mother. They shared their contact information, offering to be witnesses. The man who first recorded the incident, who turned out to be a civil rights attorney, gave Dr. Chen his business card. "What's going to happen now, Mom?" Sarah whispered, still trembling slightly but feeling safer with all the support around them. "Justice will happen, sweetheart," Dr. Chen replied, hugging her daughter close. "What that woman did was very wrong, and she's going to learn that actions have consequences." Through the windows, they could already see the flashing lights of police vehicles waiting at the gate. This was far from over, and Catherine Whitman was about to learn exactly how serious the consequences of her actions would be. The plane came to a complete stop at the gate, and two police officers boarded immediately. They were followed by a paramedic who headed straight for Sarah to check her injuries. The entire first-class cabin had transformed into an impromptu crime scene. "My name is Officer Rodriguez," the female police officer announced, while her partner positioned himself near Whitman. "We received a report of assault on a minor and would like statements from everyone involved." Whitman suddenly changed her attitude completely, putting on a tearful performance. "Officers, this is all a huge misunderstanding," she said, dabbing at her eyes with an expensive silk handkerchief. "I'm actually the victim here. This child was being disruptive, and when I tried to help her with her book, everyone turned against me." The other passengers immediately protested. The civil rights attorney, who introduced himself as James Morrison, stepped forward with his phone. "Officers, I have clear video evidence of everything that happened. This woman assaulted the child and used racial slurs. The video shows her shoving the girl hard enough to make her hit the window. I have additional footage from a different angle," the college student added, coming forward. Several other passengers also indicated they had recordings. The paramedic, a gentle-faced woman named Maria, carefully examined Sarah's shoulder and head. "There's already bruising forming on her shoulder," she reported to the officers. "She'll need proper medical documentation of these injuries." Dr. Chen held her daughter's hand throughout the examination, her doctor's training helping her stay calm despite her anger. "We want to press charges to the fullest extent of the law," she stated firmly. This was a hate crime against a child. Officer Rodriguez nodded seriously as she took notes. "Ms. Whitman, please gather your belongings. You'll need to come with us to the station." She turned to Dr. Chen. "Ma'am, we'll need you and your daughter to come as well to file a formal complaint. We can arrange for another flight for you later." As Whitman was being escorted off the plane, she suddenly realized just how many phones were recording her walk of shame. Her designer clothes and perfectly styled hair couldn't hide the ugly truth of her actions anymore. Several passengers called out "Shame on you" as she passed. The airline's customer service manager had boarded by this point and approached Dr. Chen and Sarah. "We are deeply sorry for this traumatic experience," she said sincerely. "We're upgrading you to our best first-class seats on the next available flight to Atlanta, and we'll be providing you with lifetime premium status on our airline. Additionally, Ms. Whitman is now permanently banned from flying with us." Jenny, the flight attendant who had first tried to handle the situation, knelt beside Sarah. "You are so brave," she told the girl, presenting her with a special pilot's wings pin. "The captain wanted you to have this. He said it's for showing courage in a difficult situation." Sarah managed a small smile as she accepted the pin. The kindness of everyone around her was helping to ease the shock of what had happened. Passengers were coming forward one by one, offering their support and contact information. A woman who identified herself as a school counselor gave Dr. Chen her card. "If Sarah needs someone to talk to about this trauma, please don't hesitate to call. Children shouldn't have to face such hatred." As they prepared to leave the plane, the other passengers formed a sort of honor guard in the aisle. Many reached out to pat Sarah's shoulder gently or offer words of encouragement. The college student who had shown Sarah pictures of her puppy even promised to send updates about her dog to help cheer Sarah up. "Mom," Sarah whispered as they walked through the terminal, escorted by airline staff, "all these people stood up for us." Dr. Chen squeezed her daughter's hand. "Yes, they did, sweetheart. For every person like that woman, there are many more good people who will stand against hatred. That's something important to remember from all this." Through the terminal windows, they could see police cars with flashing lights. In one of them sat Catherine Whitman, her perfect hair now disheveled, her face a mask of anger and fear as she realized her actions would have serious consequences. The incident was already being uploaded to social media, and soon Catherine Whitman would become the latest example of racism facing swift and public justice. But for now, Sarah and her mother followed Officer Rodriguez to give their statements, knowing they had the support of countless witnesses and a community that refused to stay silent in the face of hate. At the police station, Sarah sat in a child-friendly interview room decorated with colorful posters and stuffed animals. A specially trained child advocate named Ms. Torres sat with her while she gave her statement, making sure she felt safe and comfortable. "Can you tell me what happened on the plane?" Ms. Torres asked gently, offering Sarah a box of colored markers and paper to draw while she talked. Sarah described everything clearly, from the moment Whitman first appeared to the painful shove that made her hit her head. As she spoke, she drew a picture of the plane's interior, marking where everyone had been sitting with different colored dots. Meanwhile, in another room, Dr. Chen worked with detectives to file formal charges. The police had already collected video evidence from multiple passengers, and the airline had provided security footage from the gate showing Whitman's aggressive behavior even before boarding. The charges will include assault on a minor, hate crime enhancement, and disrupting a commercial flight, Detective Johnson explained. "Given the clear evidence and multiple witnesses, this is a strong case." Outside the police station, the story was spreading rapidly across social media. The videos posted by passengers had gone viral, with millions of views in just a few hours. #JusticeForSarah and #PlanetKaren were trending nationwide. News vans began arriving at the police station, but officers kept them at a safe distance to protect Sarah's privacy. However, one detail that quickly emerged was Catherine Whitman's identity. She was revealed to be the vice president of marketing at a major corporation, and her actions on the plane were now causing a massive public relations crisis for her company. Back in the interview room, Sarah finished her statement and her drawing. Ms. Torres had been impressed by how clearly the 9-year-old could articulate what happened, even though it had been traumatic. "You're very brave," Ms. Torres told her, noting how Sarah had remained polite even when describing Whitman's horrible behavior. "Would you like to see your mom now?" Sarah nodded eagerly, and moments later, Dr. Chen entered the room, immediately wrapping her daughter in a warm hug. "The airline has booked us on a new flight for tomorrow morning," she told Sarah. "And guess what? Grandma saw what happened on the news and she's making extra dumplings for when we arrive." A soft knock on the door interrupted them. Officer Rodriguez entered with some news. "We wanted to let you know that Ms. Whitman has been formally charged and is being held on bail. Her employer has also released a statement condemning her actions and announcing her immediate suspension pending investigation." The civil rights attorney, Mr. Morrison, had stayed to help and now appeared with additional information. "Several passengers have already submitted their video evidence, and I've been contacted by 3 civil rights organizations offering to support your case. They want to make sure this incident leads to meaningful change in how airlines handle discrimination." The paramedics' report had documented Sarah's injuries, including photographs of the bruising on her shoulder and a small bump on her head where she had hit the window. These would be crucial evidence for both the criminal case and civil lawsuit. As evening approached, Sarah and her mother were escorted to a nearby hotel where the airline had arranged rooms for them. The hotel manager, having heard about the incident, upgraded them to a suite and sent up complimentary room service. "Mom," Sarah said as they sat eating dinner in their hotel room, "do you think Ms. Whitman hates all kids who look like me?" Dr. Chen put down her fork, choosing her words carefully. "Some people carry hate in their hearts because they don't understand or fear what's different from them. But remember how many people stood up for you today? They showed that love and kindness are stronger than hate." Sarah thought about the pilot's wings pin Jenny had given her, which she now wore proudly on her purple sweater. She thought about the grandmother who gave her chocolate, the college student who showed her puppy pictures, and all the other passengers who had protected her. As they prepared for bed, Dr. Chen's phone kept buzzing with messages of support from friends and family who had seen the news. Sarah's school principal had called to offer counseling services and to discuss doing an assembly about standing up to racism. What had started as a traumatic incident was transforming into something bigger, a moment that would spark important conversations about racism, justice, and the power of communities standing together against hate. And somewhere in a jail cell, Catherine Whitman was beginning to realize that her actions would have consequences far beyond what she could have imagined. The next morning, as Sarah and her mother prepared for their rescheduled flight to Atlanta, the consequences of Whitman's actions were spreading like wildfire across the nation. The viral videos had reached over 20 million views overnight, and major news networks were running the story in their morning broadcasts. Catherine Whitman's employer, Global Marketing Solutions, issued a public statement at 9 a.m. "We have terminated Ms. Whitman's employment effective immediately. Her actions go against everything our company stands for, and we have zero tolerance for racism or violence of any kind." Within hours, more details about Whitman's past emerged. Former coworkers came forward with stories of similar discriminatory behavior that had gone unreported. A group of junior employees revealed they had been afraid to complain about her racist comments, fearing they would lose their jobs. Sarah and her mother arrived at the airport for their new flight, this time with a special escort from airline security. The other passengers from yesterday's incident had created a private social media group to support the Chen family, and many had changed their profile pictures to a purple star, matching Sarah's lucky sweater. "Look, Mom." Sarah pointed at her phone, where her best friend Emma had sent her a video. Emma's entire class had recorded a message of support, each student holding up signs saying, "We stand with Sarah," and "No place for hate." As they walked through the terminal, people recognized them from the news. But instead of making Sarah uncomfortable, their reactions were heartwarming. An elderly couple offered her a gentle smile and a thumbs up. A group of flight attendants from different airlines stopped to give her high fives. Meanwhile, at the county jail, Whitman was facing her first bail hearing. Her expensive lawyer argued for her release, but the judge was unmoved by their arguments. Given the severity of the charges, including assault on a minor with hate crime enhancements, bail is set at $500,000, the judge declared. Additionally, the defendant is prohibited from using any commercial air travel and must surrender her passport. Back at the airport, Sarah and her mother boarded their new flight to Atlanta. This time, the entire crew had prepared something special. The captain came out of the cockpit to personally welcome them, and the flight attendants had decorated their seats with welcome cards signed by the whole crew. "We want you to know that you're always welcome here," the captain said, kneeling to meet Sarah's eyes. "And we've made sure everyone knows that what happened yesterday will never happen again on our airline." As the day progressed, more organizations stepped forward to support the Chen family's case. The Anti-Defamation League offered legal support, and several civil rights groups announced they would use this incident to push for stronger anti-discrimination policies in air travel. Whitman's social media accounts, which had been filled with luxury travel photos and boastful posts about her executive position, were flooded with thousands of negative comments. Her carefully curated image of success had crumbled overnight, replaced by viral videos showing her true character. By evening, a GoFundMe page set up by the passengers to support Sarah's future education had raised over $100,000. People from around the world left messages of encouragement, many sharing their own experiences with discrimination and praising Sarah's bravery. Dr. Chen's hospital colleagues organized a support rally, planning to greet them at Atlanta's airport with signs and balloons. Sarah's grandmother had invited the entire Chinese-American community in her neighborhood to prepare a welcome celebration. Local news stations in Atlanta prepared to cover their arrival, but respected the family's request for privacy. Instead of focusing on the trauma, they highlighted the overwhelming community response and the positive changes being demanded as a result of the incident. As their plane cruised at 30,000 feet, Sarah looked out the window at the clouds below. The flight attendant who had given her extra cookies smiled as she passed by, and several passengers had quietly offered them supportive nods. "Mom," Sarah whispered, "I think something good is coming from something bad." Dr. Chen squeezed her daughter's hand. "You're right, sweetheart. Sometimes it takes one brave person to show everyone else how to stand up against wrong things. You didn't let fear win." The plane continued its journey toward Atlanta, carrying not just a mother and daughter, but a story that would become a powerful example of how communities can unite against hatred. And in a jail cell back in Boston, Catherine Whitman was beginning to understand that her moment of rage had not only destroyed her career, but had also helped spark a national conversation about racism and accountability. 1 month after the incident, Sarah sat in her grandmother's cozy Atlanta living room, surrounded by a mountain of letters. People from all over the country had been sending her cards, drawings, and messages of support. Her grandmother, Mrs. Chen, helped her sort through them while traditional Chinese music played softly in the background. "Look at this one, Sarah," Mrs. Chen said, holding up a colorful drawing from a third-grade class in California. The students had drawn themselves forming a human chain around a girl in a purple sweater. "They're learning about standing up to bullies because of you." The incident had sparked significant changes in the airline industry. Major carriers announced new mandatory anti-discrimination training for all staff. The Airline Passengers Rights Association had drafted the Sarah Chen Rule, which called for stricter penalties against passengers who engaged in discriminatory behavior. Dr. Chen entered the room with her laptop, smiling. "Sarah, your principal just emailed. They want you to speak at next month's school assembly about courage and standing up to racism. Would you like to do that?" Sarah thought about it carefully. The past month had been a whirlwind of changes. The viral videos had been viewed over 50 million times, and her story had been featured on major news networks. Civil rights organizations had used the incident to push for stronger anti-discrimination laws in public transportation. "I think I should," Sarah replied thoughtfully, "if it helps other kids who might be scared." The legal consequences for Catherine Whitman continued to mount. The federal prosecutor had added additional charges after more witnesses came forward. The civil rights attorney, Mr. Morrison, had filed a lawsuit on behalf of the Chen family, with all proceeds pledged to anti-discrimination education programs. Whitman's fall from grace had been swift and complete. After losing her $200,000 a year job, she had become unhireable in her industry. Her country club membership was revoked, and former friends publicly distanced themselves. Her own children had released a statement apologizing for their mother's actions and condemning her behavior. But the most significant changes were happening in communities across the country. Schools were using the incident to teach students about standing up to racism. Companies were reviewing their discrimination policies. People were sharing their own stories of confronting prejudice, inspired by how passengers on that flight had united to protect Sarah. The airline had kept its promise of lifetime premium status for the Chens, but they'd gone further. They created a new position, Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, and implemented mandatory bias training for all employees. Other airlines quickly followed suit. Sarah's story had even reached the White House. The president's office had sent her a personal letter commending her bravery, and several members of Congress cited her case while proposing new anti-discrimination legislation for public transportation. The GoFundMe account had grown to over $500,000, which the Chen family decided to use to establish a foundation supporting anti-racism education in schools. They named it the Purple Star Foundation, after Sarah's lucky sweater. That evening, as Sarah helped her grandmother make dumplings, extra ones, just as promised, she thought about how much had changed. Her classmates no longer treated her differently because of her race. Instead, they asked questions about Chinese culture and wanted to learn more about her heritage. "Grandma," Sarah asked, folding a dumpling carefully, "do you think things will keep getting better?" Mrs. Chen, who had experienced discrimination for decades since immigrating to America, smiled at her granddaughter. "Yes, because of brave people like you who show others how to stand up for what's right." Dr. Chen watched them from the doorway, proud of how her daughter had handled the attention and responsibility thrust upon her. The trauma of that day on the plane had not disappeared, but Sarah had channeled it into something positive, helping others find their voice against discrimination. Later that night, as Sarah prepared for bed, she looked at the pilot's wings pin still attached to her favorite sweater. It reminded her not of the scary moments, but of all the people who had stood up for her, the passengers, the flight crew, and now an entire nation of supporters. The incident that Katherine Whitman had intended as an act of hate had instead become a powerful catalyst for positive change. Sarah had shown that even a 9-year-old girl could help make the world a little better, one brave moment at a time. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring more letters to read, more people to help, and more chances to show others that love was always stronger than hate. 3 months after the incident, Katherine Whitman stood before the federal judge for her sentencing hearing. The courtroom was packed with media representatives and civil rights activists. Sarah and her mother sat in the front row, supported by many of the passengers from that fateful flight. "Ms. Whitman," the judge began, his voice stern and clear, "your actions were not just an assault on a child, but an attack on the basic principles of human dignity. This court sentences you to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 5 years of probation." Whitman, no longer wearing designer clothes but a simple dark suit, showed no emotion as the sentence was read. Her perfectly styled hair and privileged attitude were gone, replaced by the harsh reality of consequences. Outside the courthouse, Sarah spoke to reporters for the first time since the incident. Standing tall in her purple sweater, now adorned with both the pilot's wings and a new Purple Star Foundation pin, she delivered a message that would be quoted in newspapers across the country. "I forgive Ms. Whitman," Sarah said clearly, "because holding on to anger only hurts ourselves. But forgiving doesn't mean forgetting. We must keep working to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The Purple Star Foundation had already begun its work in schools across America. Using the settlement money and donations, they had developed anti-racism programs that taught children about diversity, kindness, and standing up against discrimination. Sarah's story was now part of their curriculum. The airline industry had transformed its approach to passenger behavior. The Sarah Chen rule had been officially adopted by all major U.S. carriers, implementing zero-tolerance policies for discriminatory actions with immediate consequences. Flight attendants received special training in handling such situations. Jenny, the flight attendant from that day, had been promoted to lead the airline's new passenger inclusion training program. She'd often used her experience from that flight to teach others how to handle discrimination professionally and effectively. Sarah's school had changed too. Her speech at the assembly had inspired a monthly, Standing Together program where students shared their experiences and learned about different cultures. The Purple Star had become their symbol for unity and courage. Dr. Chen had received hundreds of letters from other parents sharing similar experiences and thanking her for standing strong. She used her platform to advocate for better protection of minorities in public spaces and helped other families navigate the legal system when facing discrimination. The civil rights attorney, Mr. Morrison, had successfully lobbied for new state laws strengthening penalties for hate crimes on public transportation. He often cited Sarah's case as the turning point that made these changes possible. As for Catherine Whitman, her story became a cautionary tale about the price of hatred. Her prison sentence was just the beginning. She had lost her career, her social status, and most importantly, her dignity. Her name would forever be associated with one of the most publicized examples of racism and its consequences. But the most significant change was in Sarah herself. The scared little girl from that flight had grown into a confident young advocate for change. She still loved reading her books and making dumplings with her grandmother, but now she also spoke at schools, sharing her story and helping other children find their voice. On the one-year anniversary of the incident, Sarah and her mother boarded another flight to Atlanta. This time, they were greeted with smiles and respect. The purple star pins on their clothes were recognized by fellow passengers, many of whom wore similar pins in solidarity. As the plane took off, Sarah looked out the window at the clouds below, just as she had done that fateful day. But now, instead of fear, she felt hope. She had learned that even the darkest moments could lead to positive change if people stood together against hatred. "Mom," Sarah whispered, holding her mother's hand, "we did it. We really made a difference." Dr. Chen smiled at her daughter, remembering how far they had come. "Yes, sweetheart, we did. And we'll keep making a difference, one purple star at a time." The story of the plane Karen had evolved into something much more meaningful, a testament to the power of courage, community, and positive change. Sarah Chen's name would be remembered not as a victim, but as the brave little girl who helped America take one more step toward a better, more inclusive future. And somewhere in a federal prison, Catherine Whitman had plenty of time to reflect on how her moment of hatred had inadvertently sparked a movement of love and understanding that would continue to grow long after her sentence was complete.